This is Before It Was Addiction: The Psychology of Coping, Avoidance, and Relief by Monica Jensen, President of the UAGC Psych Club 2025 to 2026. When we talk about addiction, we usually start at the point where damage is visible. We talk about dependence, escalation, consequences. But psychologically, addiction doesn't begin there. It begins earlier, at the level of coping. Before it was addiction, it was relief. Before it was dependence, it was regulation. Before it was harmful, it was helpful. This talk is about that early phase, the phase where behavior feels adaptive, because understanding that phase changes how we understand everything that follows. Before we talk about addiction, coping, or escalation, we need to start with something simple. The brain does what works. If something reduces stress, the brain notices. If something lowers anxiety, the brain encodes it. If something quiets emotional pain, the brain strengthens the pathway. The brain is not a moral organ. It is a regulatory organ. It evolved to prioritize survival and stability in the present moment. When distress arises, the brain searches for what brings it down. And when a behavior successfully reduces that distress, the brain reinforces it, regardless of whether that behavior will be helpful 5 years from now. It does not ask, is this sustainable? Will this create consequences later? Is this socially approved? It only asks, did this help? That's the learning rule. And that learning rule applies to exercise, connection, meditation, scrolling, alcohol, or other substances, anything that changes the internal state. The brain does what works. Everything we're about to discuss builds from that simple principle. If we understand that, addiction stops looking mysterious. It starts looking like learning. When most people imagine addiction, they imagine craving. They imagine compulsion, loss of control, desperation. But psychologically, that's not where it starts. Addiction rarely begins with craving. It begins with relief. Pre-addiction is the stage where a behavior is still functional. It works. It solves a problem. You're anxious and something quiets it. You're overwhelmed and something softens it. You're lonely and something connects you. You can't sleep and something helps you to rest. In that moment, the behavior is not pathological. It's regulatory. This is what pre-addiction often looks socially acceptable. It looks normal. It looks adaptive. Just taking the edge off, unwinding after work, helping me sleep. From a learning perspective, what matters is not morality. What matters is outcome. If behavior reliably reduces distress, the brain strengthens the pathway. And here's the critical piece. Relief is one of the most powerful teachers the brain has. Relief produces immediate reinforcement, and immediate reinforcement outweighs delayed cost in the brain's learning system. Consequences are abstract. Relief is psychological. The body feels it, and the body learns from it. So before addiction becomes visible, before escalation, before dependence, there's a period where the behavior makes sense. And that's what makes it powerful. Because when something works, the brain does not ask, is this sustainable long term? It asks, did this help? Pre-addiction is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is reasonable. It's understandable. And that is precisely why it can evolve unnoticed. Before we go further into addiction, we need to pause and clarify something essential. Coping is not weakness. Coping is a human skill. Every nervous system is built to regulate distress. When something feels overwhelming, the brain looks for stability. It looks for a reduction in intensity. It looks for something that restores equilibrium. That's coping. We cope when we exercise after a stressful day, call someone when we feel lonely, distract ourselves when something hurts, eat when we feel empty. None of these behaviors are inherently pathological. They are attempts to regulate internal states. Psychology defines coping as the cognitive and behavioral efforts used to manage stress and emotional strain. Notice that word, manage, not eliminate, not solve permanently, manage. The brain is constantly asking, how do I bring this down? How do I make this tolerable? How do I stay functional? Now, here's where nuance matters. Coping strategies vary in long term impact, but they all are driven by the same goal, regulation. When we talk about addiction later, we cannot skip this step because addiction grows out of coping. It doesn't appear in a vacuum, it emerges from strategies that once worked. And this is important for stigma reduction. If we begin the conversation at addiction, we miss the humanity underneath it. If we begin at coping, we recognize ourselves in the mechanism. The difference between healthy and harmful coping is rarely about intention. It's about trajectory. Some coping expands capacity over time, connection, exercise, and skill building, whereas some coping narrows capacity over time, avoidance, numbing, chemical regulation. But in the beginning, they are both attempts to survive something. So when we say before it was addiction, what we're really saying is before it was addiction, it was coping. And that distinction changes how we understand everything that follows. Avoidance isn't dramatic, it's efficient. If something feels overwhelming, conflict, shame, anxiety, grief, or even boredom, a behavior reduces that feeling quickly, the brain encodes that connection. This is negative reinforcement. Not negative in bad, but negative as in removal. The behavior removes something unpleasant. Anxiety drops, tension softens, thoughts quiet, emotion dulls. The relief is immediate, and immediate relief is neurologically powerful. Here's how the progression unfolds. Step 1, avoidance reduces discomfort. Maybe it's distraction, maybe it's work, maybe it's scrolling, maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's something else. The key is that it works. Step 2, repetition strengthens the pathway. Each time distress leads to relief through that behavior, the neural pathway strengthens. The brain learns this solves the problem. Step 3, relief becomes preferred. When distress appears, the brain doesn't scan widely for options, it defaults to the fastest known solution. The question is no longer what could help, it becomes when can I access that relief? Step 4, preference becomes pattern. The behavior starts happening with less deliberation. It becomes automatic. Habit circuitry takes over. It becomes predictable. Step 5, pattern becomes dependence. Now the nervous system expects that form of relief. Without it, distress feels sharper and baseline regulation has shifted. And here's the important psychological truth. At no point in this early process does the brain say, let's develop an addiction. It says, this works. Addiction is reinforced avoidance. It's what happens when one regulatory strategy becomes dominant, inflexible, and chemically amplified. And that's why simply saying stop avoiding misses the point, because the avoidance is solving something. If we don't identify what it's solving, we can't replace it. Avoidance becomes addiction not because someone is weak, but because relief is persuasive, and the brain learns quickly from what reduces pain. When we think about addiction, we often imagine the brain learning pleasure, but very often, especially in the early stages, the brain isn't learning pleasure, it's learning relief. That distinction matters. The brain's primary job is survival and regulation. It constantly tracks patterns between discomfort and reduction of discomfort. When distress appears, anxiety, shame, loneliness, overwhelm, and a behavior reduces it, the brain strengthens the connection between the two. This is reinforcement learning. The brain doesn't evaluate the behavior morally. It doesn't ask whether it's healthy long term. It asks, did that reduce distress? If yes, the pathway strengthens. And strengthening happens neurologically through dopaminergic learning systems, not just the reward system, but the prediction system. Dopamine is not just about pleasure, it's about expectation. When relief consistently follows a behavior, the brain begins to anticipate it. Over time, the anticipation of relief becomes almost as powerful as the relief itself. That's when cues start to matter. Stress becomes a cue. Time of day becomes a cue. A specific emotion becomes a cue. Even a specific room or person can become a cue. And the brain begins preparing for relief before the behavior even happens. Here's the crucial psychological shift. The lesson encoded is not, "this is harmful." The lesson encoded is, "this works." Relief becomes the teacher. And because relief is felt in the body, heart rate slows, muscles relax, thoughts quiet. The learning is visceral. This is why early stage patterns can feel reasonable. They are solving a problem in the short term. The brain is not malfunctioning, it's doing what it evolved to do: prioritize immediate stabilization. Addiction develops when this learning becomes dominant, when one pathway outcompetes other regulatory strategies. When relief becomes the primary lesson, flexibility decreases. The nervous system stops exploring alternatives, and that's when the trajectory narrows. So, if we want to understand addiction, we have to understand what the brain actually learned. It didn't learn be addicted, it learned this reduces pain. And that is a very human lesson. Once relief becomes the lesson, repetition takes over. Every time distress leads to the same behavior and relief follows, the neural pathway strengthens. The brain begins to conserve energy by automating the sequence. This is habit formation. Habits are not inherently negative. In fact, they're essential. Habits allow us to drive without thinking about every moment. They allow us to walk without conscious deliberation. They free up cognitive resources. The brain prefers habits because they are efficient, but that same efficiency applies to coping behaviors. If stress reliably leads to alcohol or scrolling or work or numbing and relief follows, that sequence becomes chunked into a single behavioral unit. Now, something important shifts. At first, the behavior is chosen. I'm stressed. I'll do this. After repetition, it becomes cued. I'm stressed. And the body begins preparing before the conscious decision is ever made. Eventually, the cue alone activates the behavior automatically. The brain stops evaluating alternatives altogether. This is when people say, "I didn't even think about it. It just happened. I found myself doing it." That's not denial, it's automation. And automation often develops long before dependence is obvious. This is where cravings begin to emerge, not necessarily as a desire for pleasure, but as anticipation of relief. The nervous system begins to expect the regulatory shift. If the behavior doesn't occur, distress may feel sharper, not because the original stress is worse, but because baseline regulation has adjusted. The system has recalibrated around that form of relief. This is why simply removing behavior feels destabilizing. You're not just removing a substance, you're disrupting an automated regulatory circuit. From learning to habit is a gradual shift. There's no dramatic moment, there's just repetition. And repetition turns coping into a pattern, pattern into routine, routine into expectation. And expectation is where dependence quietly begins. If relief taught the brain and repetition built the habit, stress is what locks the pattern in. Under acute stress, the body mobilizes. That's adaptive. But under chronic stress, grief, trauma, financial strain, relationship conflict, something more subtle happens. Executive functions begin to weaken. the part of the brain responsible for reflection, long-term planning, and impulse regulation. Those systems become less accessible under sustained stress. At the same time, habit systems become more dominant. The brain shifts from flexible problem solving to efficiency. In other words, when pressure increases, the brain relies more heavily on what already works. If a particular behavior has reliably reduced stress in the past, stress makes it more attractive, not less. Now consider how this feels subjectively. You're overwhelmed, you're depleted, you don't have cognitive bandwidth to experiment with new coping strategies. The nervous system wants speed. It wants certainty. It wants the fastest regulatory shift available. That's when escalation happens. Frequency increases, quantity increases, intensity increases. Not because the person suddenly wants destruction, but because stress amplifies urgency. Stress narrows the behavioral menu. If healthy coping strategies are limited, inaccessible, or underdeveloped, the brain defaults to the strongest learned pathway. And here's an important nuance. Stress doesn't invent addiction. It accelerates patterns that were already reinforced. This is why relapse risk increases during periods of life transition, trauma, or instability. The system under pressure seeks efficiency. Addiction becomes the most practiced regulatory tool in the toolbox. The more stress persists, the more rigid the pattern becomes. It's not about weakness, it's about neurobiological prioritization. Under pressure, the brain chooses familiarity over exploration, and familiarity often wins. By this time, a pattern becomes addiction. It is no longer just a behavior, it's a regulatory system. So when someone stops, they are not simply removing a substance, they are removing relief. And when that relief disappears, the nervous system is exposed. Remember what the brain learned earlier. This reduces distress. If that pathway is suddenly removed, the distress doesn't disappear with it. In fact, it often feels amplified. Why? Because the baseline has shifted. When a behavior repeatedly lowers anxiety or numbs emotional pain, the nervous system recalibrates around that lowered state. When the behavior is removed, the original stress returns, sometimes more intensely, because the body has adapted to the presence of relief. It's not weakness, it's neuroadaptation. Now imagine someone under stress, chronic stress, who has relied on one primary regulatory strategy. When that strategy is removed without replacement, the nervous system experiences exposure. Anxiety spikes, irritability rises, sleep destabilizes, and emotions intensify. And the brain does what it always does under distress. It looks for relief. This is why just stop is psychologically incomplete advice. Stopping addresses the behavior, it doesn't address the regulation, and regulation is the real issue. If a person has not built alternative coping pathways, connection, movement, emotional processing, support systems, then abstinence alone leaves them psychologically dysregulated, and dysregulation feels intolerable. So relapse is often not a failure of intention, it's a failure of replacement. You cannot punish a nervous system into stability. You must teach it new ways to regulate. Stopping is hard not because people don't want to change, but because relief was doing something essential. Remove relief without rebuilding regulation and the system destabilizes. That's the psychological reality underneath why is it so hard. When we misunderstand the mechanism, we default to blame. If we see addiction only at the stage of consequence, damage, broken trust, financial harm, it is very easy to ask, why don't they just stop? Why would they choose this? Why keep something that harms them? But once we understand the progression, coping, relief, reinforcement, habit, stress amplification, neuroadaptation, the question changes. A more psychologically accurate question is, what was this helping them survive? Every addiction pattern has a function. It may regulate anxiety. It may numb trauma. It may create belonging. It may quiet shame. It may slow racing thoughts. If we don't identify the function, we cannot build an alternative. Blame focuses on behavior. Understanding focuses on the mechanism. Blame says you should have more willpower. Understanding says the nervous system was solving a problem. That shift doesn't excuse harm. It clarifies intervention. Because once we understand what a behavior was regulating, we can ask, how do we build safer, sustainable regulation? Connection instead of isolation. Movement instead of numbing. Processing instead of suppression. Support instead of secrecy. This is also where stigma begins to loosen. Addiction is often treated as an alien behavior, something other. But when you trace the pathway backward, you see something familiar. You see coping, you see relief, you see learning. The same learning mechanisms that help us form healthy habits can also form destructive ones. The difference is context, stress load, and available alternatives. When we shift from blame to understanding, we move from punishment to precision, and precision leads to better outcomes because you cannot effectively treat something you don't understand. When we zoom all the way out, what do we see? We see coping, relief, reinforcement, habit formation, stress narrowing options, and neuroadaptation. None of these processes are exotic. They are everyday psychology. Every single one of us seeks relief from distrust, repeats what works, builds habits, defaults to familiarity under stress, and narrows choices when overwhelmed. Addiction is not a different brain operating under different laws. It's the same psychological machinery operating under extreme load, extreme stress, extreme isolation, extreme trauma, extreme repetition. When conditions intensify, ordinary learning mechanisms intensify with them. What looks incomprehensible from the outside becomes predictable when you trace the pathway. Coping becomes dominant, relief becomes central, alternatives shrink, habits harden, and regulation narrows. That's escalation, and this reframing matters. Because if addiction is other, then it belongs to a different category of people. But if addiction is everyday psychology under extreme conditions, then it belongs on a continuum of human behavior. It becomes understandable, not acceptable, not harmless, but understandable. And understanding changes intervention. It shifts us from why would you do this to what conditions made this pathway so powerful? And that question is where real prevention and recovery begins. Addiction is not mysterious. It is human learning amplified. And when we see it that way, compassion becomes aligned with science, not in opposition to it. Thank you very much. These are the references that were used to create the facts in this recording.